right, everybody. Welcome to the Open Grants webinar on community engagement, how to maximize grant outcomes. Super excited to have our guest here, Chris DuMont, and really excited to dive into it. We're going to let people trickle in for a little bit, but while that's happening, just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone who's here. First of all, this is the community engagement, how to maximize grant outcomes webinar with Open Grants. My name is Sadel Trabowski. I'm the CEO and co-founder here at Open Grants, and we are the easy way to win grant funding. So super excited to dive in. As folks come into the room, please be aware that you will be able to submit any of your questions in the Q&A. We will have a recording of this available afterwards. We'll also post it on YouTube and on our blog. So if you have registered and you happen to have to leave early or whatnot, never fear. We'll take all this wonderful content and information, we'll package it all up and we'll email it out to everyone. So really excited to have you all here. And I am going to give it a couple more seconds here to let folks join, and then we'll get into the bulk of the content here. But just as a high level, we are myself. I am the founder and CEO of Open Grants. Super excited to be here. And Chris DuMont joins us from Alpine Sustains. And Chris, I'm just going to go ahead and let you give a little bit of your background and your awesome level of expertise, and then we'll kind of dive into a conversation here. So without further ado, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Sadel. Super happy to be here. Very excited to talk about community engagement. Really passionate about it. I've done community engagement, stakeholder mapping at very local levels, helping out community boards in New York Cities to global levels, working with the United Nations and doing some stakeholder mapping there, as well as with the International Water Management Institute. And what I've discovered in community engagement and in stakeholder mapping is that is an incredibly time costly process. It costs a lot of time, it costs a lot of resources. I always feel that not everyone is actually involved in the conversation that really should be, to maximize co-benefits for a project, and also to get people involved that might be negatively impacted by a project. And it was from that kind of understanding that I started looking into developing algorithms and methodologies of, who should be involved in a community project, who's relevant, and then what's the best way to approach them. And so from there, I am developing Alpine Sustains, and that's a social network for community development, which matches community members and organizations to relevant projects that they might be impacted by, or that they might actually be able to help to maximize any co-benefit.
Awesome. That's so cool. So let's get into it. I think from a high level, and this is, I think my level of understanding of what community engagement is mostly based on, I don't know if you ever saw the show Parks and Rec, but how she would have those really contentious meetings where the public would show up and just yell at the people from government. That's, I mean, that's a little bit more than that, but can you define, for everyone who's listening, can you define, what is community engagement? What does that mean from a first principles basis, if you could start with that?
Sure. For me, community engagement is anyone within a certain radius of a project. It doesn't have to necessarily be within 3 blocks. It could be within an entire 10-block radius. It doesn't really matter. But community engagement is getting all of the relevant stakeholders that are impacted by a project in a room or on a platform to be able to give their voice to anything that's going on, to have transparency from project managers to their community, and then anyone from the community to be able to say, hey, I don't like this idea, I do like this idea, we buy into this project, you should go forward. When community engagement doesn't have those 2 very core principles of transparency and proper engagement, you get things like in New York City in the Lower East Side, for example, there was a really big flood resilience project. And what ended up happening was they didn't engage with all of the right community members. And they went forward with construction. And then once the community, which had about 110,000 impacted people, realized that the seawall wasn't looking the way that they would prefer, like other parts of Manhattan, or that the project was actually going to destroy a very historical part that was very important to that community, they actually had to put a pause on the project because they did that community engagement wrong. So those two principles, transparency, involving all the right people, and actually communicating what's going on to them early in the process and throughout the process, that to me is community engagement.
Awesome. No, that seems like seems really important. I'm sure it was not only a costly mistake from a time standpoint, but I'm sure money and capital was also put at risk or potentially wasted in a really significant way. So that sounds really important. So from a high level, obviously grant funding is leveraged frequently in these sort of public projects where there's infrastructure being built or there's improvements being made or there's programs being put on the ground to do things like house the homeless or feed people or support underserved populations, that kind of thing. And community engagement holistically make sure we're involving all the right people and the public. But it sounds fairly complex. I would love to hear your thoughts on just like we've got a use case here or a case study here that you've presented where it went wrong. Maybe an example. Can you give an example of like where it went right, and then maybe pull out some of the things that were done correctly to make sure that that happened the right way?
Yeah, sure. So there was a project in New York City that went right that is very, I guess, pretty relevant to that one, is called the Big U. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but they did a lot of community engagement. It was a very long, drawn out process involving many different stakeholders. There are plenty of community board meetings with it. And there was a lot of community buy-in. I don't actually remember any friction during that process after Sandy, where community members were like, no, we don't want the Big U, it doesn't look right. They really talked to many different stakeholders and we can get a little bit more deeper into this later, that would add co-benefits. So it's not just a seawall. The Big U had nature-based solutions, biodiversity, open access to waterfronts, those kind of things. And it was thinking about involving those stakeholders and those types of topics in that project that I think made it successful and allowed a lot of community buy-in for that type of project. This is similar to a project that failed. And I think that's because they didn't involve enough community members and the right community members as well, who would really want to have certain things like making sure that the historic park stayed there. So
very cool. So it sounds like, I mean, for this to go well, you need a couple things. One is understanding like who all the stakeholders are who might be impacted by a project, which I imagine could be fairly difficult, in particular if you have a project that is big infrastructure project and maybe there's a lot of people involved, or maybe a lot of people in the area. What advice? So let's start with that, and then we could talk about transparency, and then we could talk about communication. Let's start with stakeholder mapping. How do you even go about understanding who the stakeholders are that are going to be impacted by your project? Are there tools for this? Is there a methodology that you would suggest?
Yeah, so there are different ways of going about it. There are like processes that have been used by urban planners for a really long time: power mapping, influence mapping, trying to determine who the right stakeholders are. How I go about it is a little bit differently, and it's more trying to figure out if they're going to be impacted, not necessarily their influence levels, because then I feel like you might end up neglecting certain people that really wanted to be a part of that conversation. So how I go about it is determining the different, think about topics that fit into co-benefits of the project. So for the Big U, for example, if you add nature-based solutions, you have co-benefits of open access, you have co-benefit of biodiversity if you do the project, right? And then you have certain possible negative externalities that might arise too. And then from deciding what topics fit under those two columns, you figure out who are the stakeholders. So if it's open access to the waterfront, you're going to want to talk to DOT in New York City, the Department of Transportation. If it's open access, maybe you want to include bike lanes, for example. That's maximizing co-benefits. You're improving the public health. And then maybe you want to also talk to coalitions that deal with the elderly. making sure that they have a voice in deciding, okay, maybe for the Big U project, we want to have a lot of benches because we want to make sure that elderly people feel like they are included in this, and that this new massive infrastructure project also benefits elderly persons. On the negative externality side, you might want to think of, if we're talking flood resilience, if it's a seawall, water's got to go somewhere. There's going to be negative externalities to neighboring communities if the flood wall is built incorrectly, which has happened in New York City, especially like in the Two Bridges Lower East Side area. And what ended up happening was those stakeholders who had those negative externalities hit them. They weren't aware of the project because it wasn't necessarily within their neighborhood. So it's taking those topics and then figuring out what stakeholders fit within those topics, and then having that conversation.
Awesome. That is a great breakdown on kind of a methodology. And I love that you are optimizing around, instead of influence, which I do think frequently leaves out different like community benefit orgs and other groups that maybe don't have influence, but just thinking about impacts, I think is really important. Are there any suggestions you have? So it sounded like, and the lens that you are taking on this is a lot of kind of the government or like urban planner scope. Any thoughts on how you like to see folks engage who maybe are driving the project from the private sector? So I know on this call, there's like government folks, but there's probably also entrepreneurs and other groups who are interested in, potentially partnering with government and maybe interested in like how to best broach this topic with like city planners or other groups who are interested in our stakeholders in their projects. Thoughts on that? Like how does private sector kind of best engage with the public sector when we talk about these, projects that are impacting public spaces or indeed maybe like a public good?
Yeah, 100%. So there were some people that were doing projects on my MVP for Alpine Sustains, like a kayaking project, for example, and they wanted to know the community members that might be impacted, the topics that they should think about, the coalitions that, organizations that they should talk to. And for the private sector, I think they should use the same exact approach. If you're going to be working with the city government officials, if there's an impact on a neighborhood, which every private project, there is an impact on the community in some way or another. And it's just mapping out who is going to receive co-benefits, how can we realize those co-benefits, and are there any potential negative externalities? So with that kayaking example, maybe for some reason there's added pollution because of their project. They should figure out who downstream might be impacted by that and then reach out to them, not just involving people within the local community right next to the kayaking project. Oh, hey, what do you guys think about this? And they say, oh, that's great. We have recreational tourism. So if you're in the private sector, I think you should still go about it using the same type of methodology of who's this going to impact? How can I minimize those impacts? How can I realize any co-benefits? Who are the partners to go about that co-benefit? And I think if you're any type of startup, or if you want to engage with the city, like apply for grants, let them know, hey, we want to, do this project and we want to partner with you. We also found out we have these other partners that will make this project even more awesome. We just need funding to reach out to them and get that engagement process going. And we understand that we have these negative externalities, whether it's a flood wall causing water to go to neighboring neighborhoods, or it's the kayaking project to add pollution to neighborhoods downstream. Let the government know if you're going to partner with them. And if you're not partnering with the government, still have the understanding of what your project is going to do to that community.
Awesome. No, that's great advice. I really appreciate the last bit that you mentioned, which is, request funding in your grant application to do these things. That's something super important that I think people forget sometimes, but it's actually made, and I know in very specific instances, it's made projects that I've worked on not only more attractive and more successful, but it's also made them more fundable. Like the agencies and other groups are interested, if you've included a section saying, hey, there's this planning phase that we need to fund for that involves community engagement, that involves, activation of certain leaders and other groups within the community. That's something that's super important and like that agencies love to see happen. And in fact, sometimes you'll even get points for writing that strategy a certain way and being really effective in execution. So I just want to highlight that. Remember that when you're building out your budgets, whether you be, a government agency or a private sector company, you should be budgeting for this. There's specialists that do this kind of thing. You can obviously fund, a position within your own organization, but there's also groups that, help support this. And I think that's sort of the last point that we'll touch on, and then we'll move on to transparency and communication real quick. But like, who does this? Like, who does this kind of work? Are there, I know there's consultants. I know obviously you have Alpine Sustains, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that and why you built it. But what kind of things should people be looking for? Is this something that like you should just sort of YOLO in and like try to do it yourself? Should you get a professional? Who are the people you look for to make community engagement happen the right way?
Yeah, so there are, the only way that I know from my experience is, consulting firms that specialize in community engagement. There aren't that many tools out there necessarily that kind of automate that process in a way, or give you guidance on, oh, this is the person, these are the people that you should talk to. You can read research papers on it. But I'll be honest, the community engagement field, urban planning field, and how this goes about and how people go about it, it's very stuck in the past, if I can say that way. I mean, you could just think about, your own neighborhood. How many times are you updated with a project that's going on? Or does a bike lane or a bus stop just pop up and you're just like, oh, okay, I guess that's a thing now, and no one really talks to you about it. Oh, and dialing back to what you said about budgeting for community engagement, it is incredibly expensive. And there was actually an urban planner that I talked to in Boston where they delayed a project because they couldn't get funding for community engagement and actually talk to the relevant stakeholders. So please budget that if you're going to go do a project in a community that's going to impact a lot of people.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that insight. One thing I just want to mention to everyone listening, appreciate y'all being here. Please do drop in your questions in the Q&A. We will, guard off some time at the end here to answer those. So if you do have questions, pop them in there. So we've covered, community engagement, starting with stakeholder mapping, understanding who's involved. Probably a good idea to get somebody to do this professionally, if it's not like a core skill of yours or of your organizations. And definitely it's something that not only is good to budget for, but you should. And it's also something that can make your grant application more competitive, because it does optimize for positive, good outcomes at the end of your project. So it's something that agencies want to see, and certainly something that you should be thinking about when you're developing a project. So please do put that on the radar if it's not there yet. So let's talk a little bit, stakeholder mapping. We've kind of dived into that. Let's talk a little bit about, transparency and communication, which I think go hand in hand. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on not only, what does that look like when it's done right, but what things should folks be considering, right, when they're trying to, do this the right way, or trying to support, a consulting firm doing it the right way. Are there some best practices, some thoughts you have on, how to engage in, one, being really transparent, and two, making sure that you're actually communicating with folks and not just like screaming into the void? Because one thing I see a lot, for example, are agencies that will say, hey, we're doing this project. And then nobody listens to their local government. I feel like there's a part of this that's like, hey, did you reach out? But there's another part of it's like, people don't care and they don't pay attention.
Yeah, you're 100% right about the latter part. A lot of community members don't care until it really impacts them. They're like, oh, those parking spots are gone. There's a bike lane now. I wish I was at least a part of that conversation for a brief moment. And that's because that's transparency done wrong. And we'll get into Alpine Sustains in a bit, but when it comes to transparency and community engagement, this is where I really feel the urban planning field and anyone else doing community engagement, it's a little bit before the digital age, a lot of, if you want to get your voice heard, if you want to be a part of that conversation for a project, you have to go to a community board meeting. And like you kind of said about the Parks and Rec thing, a lot of people just mad, yelling at the government official. But what if you don't have time to go to that community board meeting, but you really care about getting involved in your community? You don't necessarily have an outlet for that. And one of the reasons why I developed Alpine Sustains in the way that I did was my brother, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like Hurricane Ida, I think. He got stuck out in the street and there was a flood. He got in safely, everything's fine. But he came in and he asked me, hey, there's a river on our street. What is our neighborhood doing to solve, like, to do flood resilience? I'm like, dude, I have no idea. I've never been updated about anything. Let me just go check really quick. And I couldn't find any flood resilience projects, at least easily. And if I had, would I even have any type of outlet to voice my opinion to say, hey, we really want this done in this way? There's no place to really do that unless I go to a community board. And then I got to be free at 6 o'clock on a certain day of the month. So that's, I think transparency is just done really wrong. And I think it's just because it's incredibly expensive to do this type of community engagement. I think there's a really good community engagement tool. I think it's called Citizen Lab. And what this organization does is they develop portals for governments so that community members can go to these portals and then see all the projects that are going on and then voice their opinion in some way. So I think that's transparency done right, is just digitize the process. Everyone is on Facebook or any type of other social network. Why not make a social network for your projects that are going on in your neighborhood and get those people involved? Because a lot of people do care. Yes, we talk about the ones that don't, but the ones that do, they deserve to have their voice heard in the process. So I think the right way to do it is by digital transparency.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's opportunities, and one thing I'd love to say is, like, I think there's a lot of opportunities to improve the digitization of a lot of this information that's ongoing. And if you're in government, there's some solutions. And if you're outside of government, maybe, voice at least that opinion that, hey, we would like to be involved. Let's get some more tools in place or things in place to help us be aware of what's going on. The other thing that I've found, though, is that, if you do want to be engaged, in particular, if you happen to be like a private company and maybe you have a little more flexibility or agility, government will frequently be appreciative of your efforts to socialize projects to the community. And you can be a good partner. And this can be, once again, something that you can budget for. And it's actually something I saw budgeted for frequently on projects I worked on, where we said, hey, look, we're going to use this, sometimes there's budgets for things like technology transfer, which classically is sort of understood to be spinning tech out of a university or some lab. But, there's opportunities to expand that, to say, hey, let's make the public aware of this thing that's happening. And so I think we can be effective partners in the private sector. We can be effective partners for government by saying, hey, maybe you don't have the infrastructure, or you don't have like the time to procure a solution from Citizen Lab, or like figure out your Twitter, presence or whatever. Maybe something that would be useful is, letting us do that. And like, let's just ask for some more money to make that move forward. So I think, that transparency thing is something that as private entities, in particular, if you're working on a grant-funded project, budget for that. Once again, like when you're building these projects and your budgets in particular, you are the master of your own destiny. Like, you're the one who requested that amount of money to do those specific things. It wasn't the government saying that you needed to take that amount of money to do specific things. So be sure to take advantage of that, like spell that out. So I think that's great advice, Chris. Digitize it, make it accessible, put it where, you brought up Facebook and Twitter, or social media networks, I think, maybe not Twitter specifically, but I love, DOE has a great, there's even officials from DOE who are pretty active on Twitter. Always enjoy following them. And, if the stuff you care about, then you can engage that way. And I think that local government and other groups can take note of that as well. But So transparency, and I think hand in hand goes communication. What kind of like strategies have you seen? And let's talk a little bit just about sort of like sensitivity and like signal to noise kinds of things. What kind of strategies have you seen function well for, communication? You talked about Citizen Lab. Any other like really good examples of like communication and transparency done well by government or by like project builders and developers?
Honestly, outside of, so Citizen Lab is one of the few digital agencies that I've seen be able to do this pretty well. But transparency and having a surveyor or like a canvas, like an urban planner, go out and just talk to people on sidewalks has been the only time that I've ever been engaged in any type of community project, unfortunately. So I can't really think of things done really well. I mean, the United Nations, they do stuff well in developing countries, but they have massive budgets for those things, whereas local governments don't necessarily have that. So like you mentioned, being able to follow DOE on social media to get updates from them. I get my updates, if anything, on my from colleagues on LinkedIn. They're like, oh, I just finish up this project, and that's how I find out something happened somewhere in New York City, which is a weird way to find out. And I'm like, oh, I would have loved to have gotten it. I love that kind of stuff, but I couldn't, unfortunately.
Yeah, I get that. Well, I think yeah, I like the other note that you brought up is just like people on the ground getting involved. That's something else that I think is discounted a bit, or just like not budgeted for enough within these projects. One of the most effective programs I've seen is the California Endowment. They have incredible grant programs, and they put boots on the ground in the communities from day one to do work. And from the agency, from not the agency, but from the endowment themselves. And I think that is such a great model because there's actually human beings doing things with human beings. And in our world of increasing digitization, right, there's a thing in terms of scale that we're always solving for, but there's also just a deeply kind of qualitative human aspect to project development and engagement that you do have to like kind of budget for. And I think you have to get okay with, this is expensive. It's a long process. And, in our world where we're just always like trying to go, there's a reason some of these things take time. And it's because we don't want to leave people out and we want people to be engaged and be part of the process. And so there just needs to be an awareness that like, hey, you're not going to get this done overnight. It's going to take time, but it will deliver this like outsized benefit to the community if you do it the right way. And ultimately, I think it also saves you money. Like in the seawall case, I bet they wish they'd done community engagement the right way. And I'm sure there's, I'm personally familiar with a few other projects where we I've seen, I won't name the agencies, but I've seen folks, just put like millions of dollars down the toilet, like just flush it away because they, forgot a few key things that they probably should have remembered to do.
Yeah, no, that sucks. Yeah, doing community engagement wrong and then not getting that community buy-in or approval from the government to like take the next step in your project because you got things wrong, that is so costly. And on the digitization point, I don't think there's any replacement from human to human contact. For people that might not have access to the internet and like poor communities, we want to talk about justice, the Justice 40 requirements. Some people in the grant ecosystem might know about that from the Biden administration. It's super important to still find a way to include those people. So it's definitely not going 100% digital, but going digital does allow you to include more people. And but you can't just replace that. It's not 100% digitalization. I would love to be able to go to my community at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday in the middle of the month. But if I can't, I still feel like I need access to be able to have my voice heard somewhere.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up another great point that especially if you live in the tech bubble, like you forget that like, hey, not everyone has access to the internet, not everyone has access to all these services, not everyone has time. Like going out and being in your community is really important. And so you want to budget and mobilize for that to optimize those outcomes for sure.
Yeah. One last point on this. Boston urban planning, the urban planners there, they have a great system for stakeholder mapping and keeping that process pretty dynamic. And to save themselves resources, they work with a bunch of different advocacy groups within those categories that I kind of mentioned. So like co-benefits on like an urban park for elderly people. They'll have coalitions that they can reach out to, like a focal point. Hey, we're doing a project that we think might benefit elderly persons within this community. Can you do the outreach for us? And that's also a really great way to save money. If you're in the private sector, you want to do a community project, partner up with advocacy groups in some way to save yourself on some budget, but make sure that you're doing that community engagement properly.
I love that you brought that up, because I think a big part of some of the Justice 40 initiative, as well as just I think winning strategies in the grant funding space, involves developing strong partnerships and leveraging those. And you should be aware, I think, be aware enough, like self-aware enough as an organization, when you have a hole in your like awareness or knowledge or capabilities to engage with certain communities, when maybe there's a lack of trust based on just systemic barriers that have been in place for many years that you didn't necessarily cause. And so, a huge proponent myself, and I think it's just wise in general, work with experts, right? We already talked about like, hey, bring in a consultant who knows this space, bring in community organizations that know their space, and, do your best to stay in your lane and find experts who understand theirs and bring them together to bring some efficiency to your community engagement strategy. So I think that's wonderful advice. On that note, there's a few great questions here in the Q&A. So we'll dive into these a little bit. Please feel free, folks on who are listening in, to throw in more. But let's get into this real quick and just talk a little bit. I think one of the first ones here is really good and goes kind of back to one of the things we're talking about. But a question here is just like, how many times did you reach out or attempt to meet with stakeholders to show you're interested in their opinion? Thoughts on that?
Like, how many times, like if I was in a community engagement project, I reach out to a stakeholder I thought would be relevant and they didn't show much interest?
Yeah, or like if they just don't get back to you or whatever. Yeah.
Oh, all the time. That was 90% of my experience. When I was doing a project in Accra, Ghana, we were working with farmers to deal with drought. There's a really bad drought that was hitting the area, and there were a bunch of different types of stakeholders that we could get involved with, and some of them were government. Obviously, it's just the agriculture sector. We needed their involvement with this. We would reach out to them, and they'd be like, "Yeah, do your little project or whatever." Or if it was farmers, they would be like, "Yeah, we're kind of fine. We're dealing with the drought ourselves." Or they just literally never get back to us. So I would say that community engagement aspect, after all the hard work of stakeholder mapping, getting rejections or something like along those lines of just no response, you should expect most people to be that way. Most people don't have time.
Do you follow up if they don't get back? Like, do you like run like kind of like, in marketing, right? We'll run like a sequence of emails, right? We'll send like 5 or whatever. Is there sort of like a standard kind of follow-up that you would suggest, or is it just like, hey, do your best and then, it is what it is?
Yeah, so when I was in Accra and also when I was doing some work in New York City with the community boards, yeah, you got to follow up several times. I think in marketing, it's like 7 or 9 times until someone actually gets back to you to make a sale. I guess the same approach could be the same. Again, you really want input from the stakeholder because you map them out to be someone who's important for this project. So I don't think you should give up after 2-3 times, but you should change the messaging. Maybe make it a little bit more personal. Maybe in the beginning, from my experience in Accra, it was, hey, this is a project that's happening. Thought you might be interested. Then over time, and this is actually how I got more feedback, was making it more personal on how that project would impact them. So if it was with the farmers, we were doing this really cool, innovative fecal sludge thing that would help their crops during drought. And we'd be like, no, this will help you save X amount on your yield. Making it more personal, making them see the co-benefits of the project for themselves. That's when they started responding. So it's definitely not enough to go about your community engagement, just being like, there's a project, you should get involved. Period.
Right.
You're not going to get a good response.
Yeah, awesome. Another question more here about budgeting. This individual, she says, I'm new to the community engagement role. I know what I should do, but not sure how to put it all in a budget. Any like high level thoughts around just building the budget out for community engagement?
Okay, so I think you would want to look at some metrics and also how the community already engages with similar types of projects. Then you could kind of determine how many hours you need to spend, what that budget is to your team, how many people that you need. Does your project require workshops, which is also additional budget? Or, you know, if you could partner with people, does that decrease your budget a little bit? Does that save you hours, but increases other people's hours? It's very complicated. I think it's incredibly contextual. I think you, as this community engagement professional, ask the question, you know your community best. Are there a lot of people going to that community board meeting where if you go to that community board meeting, you've reached a decent portion of the people that you need to speak to? Or do you find that there's only 10 people there and you need to kind of hit the pavement and knock on doors to do your community engagement? It's all incredibly contextual. Again, there are places like Citizen Lab out there that will decrease the cost a lot to you, to the community engagement professional. But other than that, yeah, it's just allocating how many people do you need to reach, how many hours is that going to take, how many people will that end up taking.
Awesome, great stuff. Good. Another question here for small business entrepreneurs applying for grants. What verbiage should you include when applying to implement funds for, you know, the greater good of the community? How important is the detail that you include? And I'll tackle a little bit of that first, just to say that definitely like having a good detailed strategy is important. It's also going to be dependent on like, you probably have some actual limitations in your application on like how to, you know, what you get to tell of that story. So important to speak to outcomes and high level like definitions of like tasks. So Chris mentioned like workshops, you know, say workshops, X amount kind of thing. But yeah, Chris, I'd love to hear your thoughts on like, is there any language that folks should use that agencies or other groups understand better, or, you know, like any specific terms that are sort of like triggering in this industry? I don't know if it's a good question or a bad question, but I'll throw it your way.
Yeah, sure. So I don't have as much experience writing grants. I tended to be a part of them and review them. But I think really mentioning these are the co-benefits to these different stakeholders, and we understand that if we get this project done, say you're doing a conservation project, and you're like, hey, this will also, you know, increase biodiversity or also reduce air pollution, which is one of the Justice 40 requirements. You can apply to Justice 40 grant if you can say that. And then also saying these are the negative externalities. I think it's whoever's reading that grant, being able to understand that, like, you know exactly what you're doing, who to reach out to, your strategy is solid, you know, every single impact of your project. I think that would be the best way to go about verbiage in a way. It's not just saying, hey, I'm doing this project, it adds trees to the neighborhood. You think it would be cool because we already got a little bit of community buy-in. Go the extra step. Say, hey, these are like primary stakeholders that will be impacted, secondary stakeholders. So if it's a conservation project, like an urban park, for example, that's going to add shade. It's going to decrease the heat island effect, for example. But you're also going to add biodiversity. You're an elderly person, if they're in a heat wave, you can go there as a safer place during a heat wave. So being able to explain those things concisely, I think would be
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree on, especially on the sort of explain those impacts concisely. Really important to be super clear. Just be aware that like the folks reviewing the grant are not going to necessarily understand the nuances specifically of what you're doing, but they will, they'll understand, oh, this provides, in addition to doing X, Y, and Z, like core things, it provides shade and it improves biodiversity. Like they'll understand those things. But try not to get too technical, be clear, be short to the point at the same time. Another great question here. Is there any good practice you recommend, perhaps in the pre-engagement stage, that would better inform and prepare the community for meaningful consultation? I assume, like, how can you prep them to give you good feedback that would really, be useful? But
maybe you can tell them just, hey, this is the feedback that we're looking for. I know with Citizen Lab, for example, they have like upvotes on projects and stuff. So like they kind of tailor the tool in a way that helps them evaluate feedback from the community in a pretty proper way. If you don't have like a digital tool like that, I think organizing workshops and then asking for specific feedback from community members or stakeholders during that workshop is just the right approach. I think just being honest, because you don't want to have a workshop, then everyone leave, and then you're scrambling with your team to be like, this person said that. Do we think they like the project? I have no idea. You think we should also this way? You're like, I don't know. There are survey tools out there that urban planners use all the time to do things like that. So I definitely look into that.
Yeah, just to drill down on that a little bit, you mentioned survey tools, you mentioned asking specific questions, which I personally think that's sort of like one of the key things, like be really specific in what you want. One of the things that I know as an entrepreneur and just like having, been in this space for a while is like people, because you're thinking about a project a lot, you think, you make a lot of assumptions when you're communicating to people about how much they're thinking about the project. And in many cases, they're thinking about the project not at all. Like they're just there because you asked them to. Maybe they had some time, but they have not thought about your project at all. And they certainly aren't thinking about these like knock-on like secondary benefits or negative impacts and externalities. So don't just expect people to like have thought through your project, because I guarantee they haven't. They have a lot of other things going on in their lives. This happens to be your full-time job, but it's not theirs. So I think that's super important, just asking those specific questions. I do want to drill down. You said there's some survey tools. Any like specific ones that you just want to throw out there that people use that could be useful for this process?
From my experience, it's been survey tools that they develop themselves. Like when I was in Ghana, when I did some urban planning projects in New York, people just kind of, they developed their own questions with no-code tools, actually. And they would invest in those survey tools, and then that's what they would use. There are any like SurveyMonkey, like there are generalist survey tools out there to get the feedback that you might be looking for, but from my experience, people have developed their own tools, and that's probably because the organizations that I did use survey tools with, they're much larger, so they have the funding to do that.
Awesome. No, I think that's great. And I mean, I think most folks on the call will be familiar with things like SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, Google Forms. Like there's a lot of ways to collect feedback from people from a tool standpoint. But it is much more important, as with, I think, anything digital, the content is really the point, right? Like you need to get good responses back. So be clear in the questions you're answering or the questions you're asking. All right, another great question here. And I think this is something that I think a lot of private sector folks experience a lot. So I'm excited. Chris, I'll get your take on this first, and then I'll dive into it a little bit as well. But this individual says, after reaching out to the city manager, economic development officials, the mayor, for assistance with a supermarket and fueling station in a food insecure community, who else should I seek assistance from on the local level? I think that maybe another way to frame this question is like, how do you find champions within government that are interested in partnering with private sector, like bringing these projects forward. At the very beginning, before you get to the community engagement part, there has to be, a project that wants to happen. I'd love to hear your thoughts on just like your feedback, having been within these orgs. What's the best way for private folks, entrepreneurs, industry in general, to engage and get like government initially excited about a project to support the community?
Yeah, sure. So I think it would be going to urban planners. Maybe it's not the mayor's office, because they have a whole bunch of other stuff other than like very specific community project that they have to deal with. So go to an urban planner that deals within your neighborhood, that you're friendly with. And if for whatever reason that doesn't work, because maybe you're in a smaller city than New York and they don't really have the capacity to, email everybody back, find out whoever is any type of coalition or organization that works with food insecure persons, or just that issue in general in that neighborhood. Reach out to that advocacy group. Be like, hey, I'm trying to do this project. Can you be, a voice for me to the government? And then if that doesn't work, build a larger coalition. Get people that aren't just dealing with like food insecurity, but maybe they're also dealing with homelessness. Get food banks on your side. Reach out to leaders for food banks. And then once you have like 10 solid voices, it would be very difficult for the city just to be like, yeah, we're going to continue to keep ignoring you. Because now you have a bunch of advocacy groups, private sector and public sector, on one issue saying, we want this project to happen. It's important.
Awesome. That's great advice. I think another thing to add on here is you maybe, maybe just to drill down, in fact, on something Chris kind of alluded to, which is that sometimes when you approach someone like the city manager, once again, it's not their job and they're not thinking about it. Like there might be someone within government whose job is to be thinking about this issue. And if so, seek them out. Urban planners, a good idea. The other thing is you may want to reach out to whoever the representative is for, like in Congress for that area. Their office frequently, because, they deal more with sort of like the constituents' issues, their office might be more responsive. But frequently what we find is when you go off to engage with government as a partner, it's much less about like they're willing or not willing to help, and much more about they tend to be overworked. They don't have a lot of good tools. They don't have a lot of bandwidth, and they really are just like trying to do their best. And sometimes it's just not a great experience for you as a citizen or as a private company. But when you drill in and find the person within, like, guarantee there's somebody within a government org whose job it is to be thinking about the thing that you're thinking about. And when you find that person, they frequently will be at least more responsive, and they may have someone on their team who can follow up. But if it is a small community, you may find a quicker path to finding that key person by, as Chris mentioned, just reach out to like a community org that might be already advocating for that. They may be plugged in. Just work your network, because there are ways to go through that process. And sometimes it's just lengthy. Sometimes it's building enough, of a coalition that people pay attention. But best of luck on that journey. I do encourage you, just like work your network and build your network as best you can to find that way in. But also be looking for the people who it's very difficult for folks in government to do things outside of what is in their scope of work for a lot of reasons. And so find the person who is responsible for that and try to go that way instead of like to the city manager or to the mayor. So just some thoughts there. Another great question. Where is a place to find community needs at a city or state level that we can make our projects to support? So I think we talked a little bit about this, just like in terms of problems with transparency and communication. But any thoughts, Chris, on like, say you're trying to bring a project or you want to get involved with supporting your community? Like, is there a place that cities or states are publishing like their needs?
Not that I felt like their needs from like community members to start their own initiatives. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, like I'll just throw out there. Oh man, I can't. Oh, City Innovate. That was the program. I think they still do things. There's a startup called City Innovate that helps communities as well as state government and local governments suggest and like actually put on like challenge competitions. And so they have like a little database of these things. There's like the American Made Challenges website where you could like look at like the federal government and some of their challenges that they have going on. The other place that you will find this information sometimes is through grant programs. Sometimes there are grants that are put out with the specific idea of addressing these issues. But Chris, I think you'll probably agree with me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, there's not a good place to find this except for going to the people whose job it is and saying, hey, how can we help? That's what I've found to be really effective.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe there's a pollution challenge and you're a concerned citizen. You're just like, I want to help, reduce pollution in my neighborhood. I know like next door kind of has something where like people can get involved and be like, hey, like we want this in our community. And then like maybe government officials might pay attention to that because you can raise enough voices on a social network like Nextdoor. But yeah, other than finding grants, specifically asking citizens for help on an issue, if you're just coming out of the blue with an issue that you want to solve for your community, it's very difficult. You just have to kind of go to whatever community leader has the authority to sign off on that. And that could be a really challenging process. I know that I think I mentioned the kayaking project earlier. Someone wanted to put a kayaking project on my platform in order to, because he thought it would really benefit the community. And he's like, well, if I can get enough people interacting with each other and saying, hey, we really want this kayaking thing, this kayaking project, then he thought that would be enough to then go to a community board member and then kind of just go up the food chain there. There is no good way. And it's all contextual too by city. Maybe some city don't have portals for these things and just walk into the mayor's office.
Yep. I think one thing I will say is despite some of the comments that we've made around some of the difficulty in accessing these folks and how busy they are, I will say that one thing that I have found to be incredibly effective is in the case that you do understand, like say you build projects in the let's say food insecurity space, just as a way of speaking to that. Say you build projects in that space. If you do have the opportunity to talk to whoever it is who's in charge of that within your local government or within the community, sometimes it's much better to go in and say, how can we help? What are the things that you're looking for? In particular, if you're a private company and you're not like, on the advocacy front, you're looking to maybe build coalitions and organize people. But if you're a project builder, so you're either going to get a grant or maybe you have a grant, you want to put something in the ground or put something in place programmatically, it's really great to go in and say, how can we help? Because it'll do two things. One, it'll let you like have a really relevant conversation with this individual who has an opportunity to sign off eventually on your project. And you'll also get like, you may have been understanding the problem from one sense, but in order to get your project funded, you really do need to understand it from their side of the table, and you need to know like what angle they're trying to come at it. And so they'll be able to explain to you exactly what they need, and then you can turn around, and if it's a good fit, you could say, all right, well, we have what you need. Like, let's be helpful. Let's work together. And that's just such a welcome experience from the public sector. Because they do frequently just have people coming in trying to sell them like the latest knickknack or gadget, because everyone wants to sell things to the government. And so if you can show up and say, hey, how can we be helpful? And then you actually have the means to be helpful based on what they said, it's a slam dunk. It helps you get, a good relationship going. It helps you understand more about what they need. And, ideally it builds that initial rapport and opens up an opportunity for you to pitch them on a good idea that you can then move forward. So lots of ways to approach that, but I will say that like if you can come in with that attitude of like, how can we be helpful, it does go a long way.
Totally right. There was like just on that point, you might see that there's a problem and you think you have the solution. If you go into that meeting and talk with that community leader, they might be like, holy cow, we've noticed that this is a problem too. Thank you so much for addressing that. Oh, you can solve it in this way. Or hey, we saw this problem, we think it's a different type of solution, but you can definitely be helpful. Yeah, definitely talk to them and get their needs understood from yours.
Awesome. Well, we have about 5 minutes left here. I really appreciate all of the great insights, Chris, and the comments. And thank you, everyone who's been listening in, for the great questions. Hopefully, some of this has been useful. I just want to mention we aren't going to go into non-community engagement related questions on this webinar. So for everyone who did ask those kinds of questions, please feel free to reach out to the team or shoot us an email. We will send a variety of follow-up information and emails out to everyone who registered, so you'll have plenty of access to myself and the team, and I'll be asking Chris for some of his info that he wants to pass along to y'all as well. So thank you all for being here. As we wrap up, Chris, I want to do two things. You've been very humble in not speaking about Alpine Sustains, which is totally fine, but I do want to touch on what you're building because I think it's relevant to this conversation and super cool. So I'd love if you want to give us the 2-minute, because we now have 4 minutes left. If you could give us 2 minutes on that, what's Alpine Sustains? What does it do? And then also, takeaway for the folks here. I know we've talked a lot about community engagement, but what's the call to action for folks on the call? Is it would love to hear your thoughts. Closing thoughts on that and Alpine Sustains.
Sure, thank you, Chanel. So Alpine Sustains is a social networking platform for community development that actually matches users or community members and organizations to projects that would be very relevant for them. So we talked about food insecurity. If you're a concerned citizen or you're a planner, community-based organization that you're doing food insecurity project with that, it would automatically tell you, hey, these are the organizations, these are the community members that you should invite into the project. And then it allows you to engage with all those people in the platform. So think like Facebook or Nextdoor. It allows you to do all that engagement in one place. It allows you to find all those relevant stakeholders automatically, and it's completely free. Then on top of that, what we do for project managers is we kind of have a built-in calculator of some sorts that allows you to put in certain project information, what you're doing. Then it tells you, hey, these are the topics that you should consider based on your project. So if it's food insecurity, also consider these other topics like homelessness. Maybe think about composting. It could be anything that's related to that specific project. And then you can go about your project that way. So when you're applying to a grant, all the different topics that you need to put into that grant application, you already know all the stakeholders that you can engage with, and you can engage with them on the platform. So that's Alpine Sustains. And
love that. I'm just gonna interject one thing really quickly to bring some of this home, which is to say that you have built an incredible tool to do community engagement. And my takeaway for the day is that community engagement is key to making sure your grant funded projects go off the right way and are successful and create ideal outcomes. So that's my takeaway. I really appreciate it. And yeah, closing thoughts, Chris.
Yeah. So just off that point, the new Justice 40 requirements, if you're doing anything with climate change or pollution, requires very robust community engagement in disadvantaged communities. Being able to go on Alpine Sustains and engage with those communities easily and understand how they might be impacted by a project, this could help you get that grant funding because it's all automated and it helps you reach out to the right community member. One big key takeaway for me from this entire conversation is kind of what Sadell was mentioning is budget for your community engagement and know exactly who you need to talk to and how you can work with those people you're talking to maximize co-benefits and reduce any negative externalities that your project might have on them. You don't want to exclude anyone from the process. And I don't think that you also want to kind of just have only certain people involved in the process that you think might be only impacted directly by the project. Think about the people that might be secondarily impacted. Make sure that they're involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Real quick, because there's 2 questions about this. Link to Alpine Sustains. Is there a website people can go to check it out? And we'll also send it off in the follow-up email. So if you registered, don't worry. But Alpine Sustains, real quick, go, and then we're out.
AlpineSustains.com. You can sign up for the newsletter. And we just finished wrapping up our MVP. We're building a beta right now, and we'll let you know when that's ready so you can get involved with your community development and make your community sustainable and resilient.
Awesome. AlpineSustains.com. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, everyone who listened in today. Appreciate you all. You can also pop over to opengrants.io. We'll be sending out a follow-up after this. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks all today.